The storm had been pounding Cedar Grove for 6 hours when Officer Kelly Monroe saw Death walking through the rain. At first, it was just a shadow limping beneath the flickering streetlight, but when lightning split the sky, her blood turned to ice. A German shepherd, soaked to the bone, dragging himself toward the police station with something clenched between his teeth. His chest heaved with each labored breath, ribs visible through matted fur, blood mixing with rainwater as it streamed down. His legs onto the cracked asphalt. But it wasn't the dog's condition that made Monroe's heart stop. It was what he carried. A muddy backpack, gripped with the desperation of a dying soldier protecting his final mission. Monroe threw open the station door as the shepherd collapsed at her feet, the backpack hitting concrete with a wet thud that echoed through the empty lobby like a gunshot. Then she heard it, a sound that would haunt Cedar Grove forever. A baby's cry, weak and fading, muffled by soaked fabric and the storm's fury. The night crew swarmed with drawn weapons, unsure what they faced, but Monroe already knew this wasn't just an injured stray. This dog had delivered something that would shatter their small town's silence forever. Inside that backpack lay a 3-month-old infant, pale and cold but breathing, wrapped in a thin towel like a fragile secret someone had tried to bury. The dog they would name Ryder had just exposed a truth that would tear through Cedar Grove like lightning through darkness, revealing horrors hidden in plain sight and a conspiracy that reached deeper than anyone imagined. As chaos erupted around them, Ryder never took his eyes off the baby, his body broken, but his mission complete. He had carried more than just a child through that storm. He had carried justice itself, bleeding and determined, to the only place where truth might survive. What they didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. Somewhere in the darkness, a killer was watching, and Ryder's heroic act had just signed his own death warrant. 3 days later, the truth began to unravel in ways no one expected. Officer Gina Morales had been haunted by the baby's cries since that stormy night, unable to shake the image of those tiny fists clenched in unconscious defiance. While reviewing missing persons files, one name made her blood run cold. Maria Gonzalez, 16 years old, reported missing 4 months ago, pregnant. Last seen at a downtown food pantry where volunteers helped troubled teens. The volunteer coordinator's name sent ice through her veins. Thomas Burke, Ryder's former handler, the same man who lived alone in a cabin deep in the woods, the same man who had called in Ryder's disappearance just days before the dog appeared with the baby. When Monroe drove out to Burke's property, her gut twisted with each mile of dirt road. The trees closed in tighter, fog clung to her windshield like desperate fingers, and the GPS signal died a quarter-mile before destination. The cabin sat in oppressive silence, weather-worn and secretive, smoke curling from the chimney like a guilty conscience. Burke answered the door before she knocked, his tired eyes holding no surprise, beard unkempt, wearing a faded hoodie that had seen better days. "You found the baby," he said flatly, stepping aside to let her in. The cabin reeked of cedar smoke and something metallic that made Monroe's skin crawl, rust or something darker. Military medals lined the walls like accusations. A folded American flag sat in its triangular case above the fireplace, and Burke remained standing, hands trembling slightly as he avoided her gaze. "Tell me about Maria Gonzalez," Monroe demanded, her hand instinctively moving toward her holstered weapon. Burke's shoulders tightened, and he looked away toward the window where morning light filtered through dirty glass. "I didn't hurt her," he whispered. "I tried to help. She came to me, said she had nowhere else to go, said her uncle wasn't safe." Monroe's stomach churned as the pieces fell into place. She was here. Burke nodded slowly, defeat etched in every line of his face. She stayed in the spare room. I brought her food, taught her how to breathe through contractions when they started. The question that would change everything hung in the air like smoke from his chimney. "Where is she now, Thomas?" Burke's eyes dropped to the floor, and when he spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper that would echo through Cedar Grove forever. "She didn't make it." Don't forget to subscribe to our channel K9 Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it. In the annals of American law enforcement, there are stories that transcend the boundaries between duty and devotion, between training and instinct, between the badge and the beating heart beneath it. What you're about to witness isn't just another tale of heroism. It's a testament to the unbreakable bond between those who serve and protect, regardless of species. Cedar Grove, Pennsylvania, population 8,500, had always been the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where crime meant vandalism at the high school, and where the most excitement the police department saw was directing traffic during the annual Harvest Festival. Officer Kelly Monroe had worked these quiet streets for 12 years, handling domestic disputes, writing speeding tickets, and occasionally dealing with drunk college kids from the nearby university. The Cedar Grove Police Department was modest: 6 full-time officers, 2 part-timers, and a dispatcher who doubled as the department's coffee maker and unofficial therapist. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened, where officers went home each night with stories about lost cats and noise complaints. But on this particular October evening, as a massive storm system rolled across central Pennsylvania, Cedar Grove was about to become the epicenter of a case that would shock the nation and redefine what it means to serve and protect. The storm itself was unusual. Meteorologists called it a perfect storm, where 3 weather systems converged to create what would later be recorded as the most intense rainfall in the county's history. 6 inches fell in the first 4 hours, turning streets into rivers and overwhelming the town's aging drainage system. Most residents had heeded the warnings and stayed indoors, leaving the streets eerily empty, except for the occasional emergency vehicle navigating the flooded intersections. It was during this chaos, when nature seemed determined to wash away every trace of human activity, that a hero emerged from the darkness, not wearing a uniform or carrying a badge, but limping through the rain with a determination that would put most humans to shame. This is the story of Ryder, a retired K-9 officer whose final mission would expose secrets buried deeper than any grave, and whose courage would force an entire community to confront the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. This is a story about loyalty that transcends death, about instincts that refuse to be silenced, and about the terrible price of remaining silent when innocence hangs in the balance. In the next hour, you'll witness how one dog's desperate journey through a storm would unravel a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government, expose a predator who had been hunting vulnerable children for years, and ultimately save not just one life, but dozens of others who might have suffered the same fate. This is more than a rescue story. It's a reckoning. Thomas Burke had been a decorated police officer for 15 years before a back injury forced him into early retirement. His service record was exemplary: commendations for bravery, community service awards, and an unblemished reputation that made him a natural choice for volunteer work with at-risk youth. Ryder, his K-9 partner, had been by his side for 8 of those years, a German shepherd whose keen instincts and unwavering loyalty had made them one of the most effective teams in the Tri-County area. They had tracked down missing persons, located evidence in countless cases, and formed a bond that seemed unbreakable. When Burke retired to his secluded cabin in the woods north of Cedar Grove, Ryder came with him, trading the excitement of police work for peaceful walks through pine forests and quiet evenings by the fireplace. The cabin itself was Burke's sanctuary, a place where he could escape the memories of a career spent confronting humanity's darkest impulses. Built in the 1960s by a logger, it sat on 12 acres of dense woodland, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through towering pines and thick underbrush. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, making it the perfect retreat for a man who valued solitude above all else. Burke had renovated the cabin himself, adding modern amenities while preserving its rustic charm: wooden beams, stone fireplace, and large windows that offered panoramic views of the surrounding forest. It was here that Burke began his volunteer work with the Greater Pittsburgh Youth Services, a network of group homes and shelters that served the region's most vulnerable children. His background in law enforcement and his gentle demeanor with troubled teens made him a valuable asset to the organization. Caseworkers trusted him. Implicitly, administrators praised his dedication, and the teenagers themselves seemed to respond positively to his patient, non-judgmental approach. What no one realized was that Burke's isolation and access to vulnerable youth had created the perfect hunting ground for a predator who understood exactly how to exploit the system's weaknesses. His cabin, so peaceful and welcoming on the surface, harbored secrets that would horrify even the most seasoned investigators. The basement had been modified in ways that didn't appear on any blueprint, creating hidden spaces where screams would never be heard and where hope went to die. Behind false walls and concealed doors, Burke had constructed a nightmare that preyed upon society's most defenseless victims. Ryder had sensed something was wrong long before that stormy night. His police training had taught him to detect deception, and his canine instincts could smell fear, even when humans couldn't see it. But loyalty is a double-edged sword, and for months Ryder had been torn between his devotion to Burke and his growing unease about what was happening in that cabin. The night he finally broke free and made his desperate journey to the police station, he wasn't just saving one baby, he was breaking his silence about horrors that had been hidden too long. Maria Gonzalez was 16 when she disappeared from the State Group home on Birch Lane, but her story began long before that October evening when she knocked on Thomas Burke's door. Born to a teenage mother who struggled with addiction, Maria had spent most of her childhood bouncing between relatives and foster homes, never staying anywhere long enough to form lasting connections or feel truly safe. By age 14, she had been placed in the Greater Pittsburgh Youth Services System, a network that was supposed to protect vulnerable children, but had become a hunting ground for predators who understood how to exploit the system's weaknesses. The group home on Birch Lane housed 12 teenage girls, all with similar stories of abandonment, abuse, and broken promises. The staff was overworked and underpaid, the oversight was minimal, and the turnover rate was so high that consistency in care was virtually impossible. Maria had learned to survive by keeping her head down, trusting no one, and never staying in one place too long. But when she discovered she was pregnant at 15, running became impossible. The father was another resident of the system, a boy who had aged out and disappeared into the streets before Maria even knew about the baby. Alone and terrified, Maria confided in her caseworker, who assured her that everything would be handled appropriately. What Maria didn't know was that her caseworker had already flagged her case to Thomas Burke, who had been volunteering with the organization for 3 years and had developed a reputation for helping girls in exactly Maria's situation. Burke presented himself as a father figure, someone who understood the complexities of teenage pregnancy and could provide the kind of stable, nurturing environment that the system couldn't offer. When he offered Maria a safe place to stay during her pregnancy, away from the chaos and judgment of the group home, it seemed like a miracle. The caseworker assured Maria that Burke was trustworthy, that he had helped other girls in similar situations, and that this arrangement would be temporary, just until the baby was born, and more permanent. Solutions could be found. Maria was desperate enough to believe them. She packed her few belongings, said goodbye to the only friends she had ever known, and followed Burke to his isolated cabin in the woods. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. Burke was kind and attentive, making sure Maria had proper nutrition and prenatal care. He set up a comfortable room for her, complete with books, art supplies, and everything a pregnant teenager might need. Ryder, his German shepherd, seemed to take an immediate liking to Maria, often lying beside her bed and following her around the cabin like a protective guardian. But as Maria's pregnancy progressed and her mobility decreased, the facade began to crumble. Burke became controlling, monitoring her phone calls and limiting her contact with the outside world. The doors that had once remained open were now locked at night, and Maria began to realize that her sanctuary had become her prison. The basement of Thomas Burke's cabin told a story that would haunt investigators for years to come. What appeared from the outside to be a simple root cellar had been systematically modified over the course of 3 years, transformed into something that belonged in the darkest corners of human imagination. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall in Burke's workshop, accessible only through a narrow passageway that could be sealed from the inside, with a mechanism that looked like part of the original foundation. The main chamber was larger than expected, carved out of the natural rock formation that lay beneath the cabin's foundation, extending far beyond the footprint of the structure above. Burke had installed soundproofing materials salvaged from a demolished recording studio, ensuring that no cries for help would ever reach the surface. The air circulation system was primitive but effective, drawing fresh air through concealed vents that emerged disguised as landscaping features and exhausting stale air. Through a camouflaged chimney that looked like part of the cabin's original construction, along the walls, Burke had constructed a series of small rooms, each barely large enough for a single occupant. The doors were reinforced steel, painted to look like wood, with locks that could only be opened from the outside using a key that Burke wore around his neck at all times. Inside each room, investigators would later find evidence of prolonged habitation, mattresses that reeked of fear and desperation, buckets that served as makeshift toilets, remnants of clothing that told stories of struggles and submission, and scratches on the walls that formed desperate tallies marking the passage of days, weeks, and months. The forensic team would eventually determine that at least 7 different individuals had been held in these chambers over the past 3 years, based on DNA evidence and personal effects that Burke had kept as trophies in a locked box beneath his bed. Maria's room was different from the others, larger and more comfortable, suggesting that Burke had intended for her stay to be longer term. Unlike the other chambers, Maria's room contained books, art supplies, and even a small television connected to a security camera system that allowed Burke to monitor her every movement. Burke had convinced himself that he was providing a service, that he was saving these girls from lives of poverty and abuse. In his twisted logic, the basement wasn't a prison. It was a sanctuary where he could protect them from the cruelties of the outside world while giving their lives meaning through forced motherhood. But the evidence told a different story. The medical supplies found in the basement revealed that Burke had been performing amateur obstetric procedures, apparently delivering babies for the girls he had imprisoned. A refrigerated storage unit contained DNA samples and what appeared to be a meticulous record-keeping system documenting the births and subsequent disposition of the infants. Most chilling of all was Burke's journal, found hidden behind a loose stone in the wall, filled with entries that revealed the mind of a man who had convinced himself that his actions were not only justified, but noble. The night Maria went into labor, Ryder knew something was terribly wrong before Burke did. The German shepherd had been restless for hours, pacing between Maria's locked room and the basement entrance, whining softly and pawing at the door. With an urgency that Burke initially dismissed as typical canine anxiety, but Ryder's police training had taught him to recognize the scent of fear, and what he was detecting that night was pure terror mixed with the metallic smell of blood that would soon fill the basement air. Maria had been experiencing contractions for nearly 6 hours when Burke finally realized the severity of the situation developing in his makeshift prison. His amateur medical knowledge, gleaned from veterinary textbooks and internet research conducted in the dark corners of medical forums, was woefully inadequate for the complications that were unfolding before his eyes. Maria was hemorrhaging, her blood pressure dropping dangerously low, and the baby was in distress, her heart rate becoming increasingly irregular with each contraction. In a normal situation, this would have been the moment to call 911, to rush to the nearest hospital, to seek professional medical intervention from doctors who could save both mother and child. But Burke couldn't risk exposure, couldn't allow the outside world to discover what he had been doing in that isolated cabin. Too much was at stake. Too many secrets would be revealed if he brought Maria to a hospital where questions would be asked, authorities would be notified, and his carefully constructed facade would crumble. Instead, he made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would deliver the baby himself in the basement chamber he had converted into a crude operating room. The makeshift delivery room he had prepared was equipped with basic supplies purchased online under false names and delivered to post office boxes in distant towns. But it was no substitute for a proper medical facility with trained professionals and life-saving equipment. As Maria's condition deteriorated throughout the long night, Burke's panic grew exponentially. He had sedated her with veterinary tranquilizers stolen from the clinic where he had once volunteered, but the drugs were affecting her ability to push during contractions while simultaneously masking the severity of her blood loss. The baby's heart rate was irregular and weakening, and Burke could see that both mother and child were running out of time with each passing minute. Ryder remained outside the basement door throughout the entire ordeal, his whining growing more frantic as the hours passed and the smell of blood grew stronger. Every instinct the dog possessed was screaming that his human was making a terrible mistake, that professional help was desperately needed, that this was wrong in ways that transcended all his years of training and loyalty. When Maria finally delivered her daughter after 14 agonizing hours of labor, the baby was barely breathing, her tiny chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. Burke worked frantically to clear her airways and stimulate her heartbeat, while Maria bled out on the crude operating table he had constructed from salvaged medical equipment, her life ebbing away as her daughter took her first breaths in that chamber of horrors. On the 4th night after Maria's death, something inside Ryder finally snapped. The loyal police dog who had spent 8 years following orders without question made a decision that would save a life and exposed the truth that Burke had tried so desperately to hide beneath lies and shallow graves. It began with the storm, the same weather system that would later make headlines across Pennsylvania as one of the most severe on record. As rain pounded the cabin roof with increasing intensity and wind howled through the pine trees like the voices of the damned, Ryder watched Burke place the increasingly weak infant into a military surplus backpack, along with formula, diapers, and a hastily written note that would never be found by investigators. Burke's plan was simple but desperate in its conception. He would drive to a neighboring county through the storm and leave the baby at a hospital emergency room, claiming he had found her abandoned on his property during a routine patrol. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would distance him from Maria's death and give the baby a chance at survival while protecting his dark secrets. But Ryder had different plans forming in his canine mind, plans shaped by years of police training and an instinctive understanding of right and wrong that transcended human moral complexity. As Burke loaded the backpack into his truck and prepared to make the treacherous drive through the storm, the German shepherd saw his opportunity and recognized it as his moment of truth. Years of police training had taught him to think strategically, to assess dangerous situations and respond with decisive action when lives hung in the balance. He knew that Burke was planning to abandon the baby, to leave her with strangers who knew nothing about her mother, the circumstances of her birth, or the horrors that had taken place in that isolated cabin. More importantly, Ryder's canine instincts told him that Burke represented a continuing threat, not just to this baby, but to other vulnerable young women who might fall into his carefully laid traps in the future. In a move that would have made his former police handlers proud of their training methods, Ryder created a calculated diversion. He knocked over a heavy lamp in the living room, sending Burke rushing inside to investigate the noise and leaving the truck door open with the backpack unattended on the passenger seat. In the few precious seconds that Burke was distracted by the crash, Ryder grabbed the backpack in his powerful jaws and bolted into the storm with determination that bordered on supernatural. The weight of the bag and the treacherous conditions made running difficult, but Ryder's resolve was absolute and unwavering. He had to get the baby to people who could help her, people who would ask the right questions and uncover the truth about what had happened. In that isolated chamber of horrors, Burke discovered the theft within minutes and gave frantic chase, calling Ryder's name and commanding him to return with the authority of their former partnership. But the dog's loyalty had been transferred to a higher purpose that transcended human commands. Through ankle-deep mud and blinding rain, over fallen branches and flooded creek beds, Ryder carried his precious cargo toward the distant lights of Cedar Grove, never looking back at the man who had betrayed everything they once stood for together. The Cedar Grove Police Department had seen its share of emergencies over the years, but nothing could have prepared Officer Kelly Monroe for what she witnessed that stormy October night. When she first spotted the shadow moving through the rain-soaked streets, her initial thought was that someone's pet had gotten loose during the storm. It wasn't unusual for animals to become disoriented during severe weather, and she had responded to dozens of similar calls throughout her 12-year career with the department. But as the figure drew closer to the station's front entrance, Monroe realized this was no ordinary lost animal wandering aimlessly through the flooded streets. The German shepherd was moving with purpose despite his obvious injuries, dragging something heavy through the flooded street with a determination that spoke of professional training and extraordinary intelligence. When lightning illuminated the scene in stark, dramatic relief, Monroe's blood ran cold. The dog was carrying a backpack in his mouth, and there was something about his posture, his focused movement toward the police station, that suggested this wasn't random wandering, but a deliberate mission orchestrated by instincts that transcended normal animal behavior. Monroe threw open the front door just as the shepherd collapsed on the threshold, his strength finally giving out after what must have been hours of struggle against the storm's fury. The backpack hit the concrete floor with a wet thud that echoed through the empty lobby like a gunshot, and that's when Monroe heard it, a sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. A baby's cry, weak and muffled, but unmistakably human, emanating from within the soaked bag like a voice from another world. The night crew response was immediate and chaotic, a testament to their training, but also to their shock at this unprecedented situation. Within seconds, officers were surrounding the collapsed dog and the mysterious package he had delivered, guns drawn as they tried to assess whether this was some kind of elaborate threat or carefully constructed trap. Lieutenant Harris barked orders while Officer Gina Morales dropped to her knees beside the backpack, her hands shaking as she carefully unzipped the main compartment with the delicacy of a bomb disposal expert. What they found inside defied every protocol they had ever learned at the police academy. A 3-month-old infant. Girl pale and cold, but breathing in shallow, rapid gasps, wrapped in a thin towel that was soaked through from the storm but had clearly been chosen with care. Her tiny fists were clenched as if she was fighting even in unconsciousness, and her skin had the bluish tinge that indicated hypothermia was setting in rapidly. Gina's training as a first responder kicked in immediately, overriding her shock and disbelief. She began warming the baby with her own body heat while shouting for someone to call the paramedics and get warm blankets from the emergency supplies locked in the station's medical cabinet. The infant's condition was critical. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and showing signs of prolonged exposure that suggested she had been in distress for days or possibly weeks. Meanwhile, the German shepherd lay motionless on the floor, watching the scene unfold, with eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence and concern for the tiny life he had risked everything to save. The investigation into baby Hope's origins began immediately, but it would take days before the horrifying truth started to emerge from the shadows of Cedar Grove's seemingly peaceful facade. Child Protective Services took immediate custody of the infant, while forensic specialists examined every inch of the backpack and its contents for clues about where she had come from and how she had ended up in the care of a wounded German shepherd during one of the worst storms in the county's recorded history. The backpack itself was military surplus, common enough that it could have been purchased at any number of stores across the region without raising suspicion. Inside, investigators found basic baby supplies, formula, diapers, a pacifier, but nothing that could identify the child or explain the circumstances that had led to her abandonment in such a dramatic fashion. What struck everyone as particularly strange was the obvious care with which she had been packed for the journey. This wasn't the hasty abandonment of an unwanted child by desperate parents, but rather the careful preparation of someone who wanted to ensure the baby's survival, despite whatever terrible circumstances had necessitated her removal from wherever she had been living. The blanket was clean despite being soaked by the storm. The formula was the expensive kind specifically recommended by pediatricians for premature or underweight infants, and even the way she had been positioned in the bag suggested extensive knowledge of proper infant care and safety protocols. Meanwhile, Ryder, as they had named the German shepherd, after discovering his collar tag was too rusted and damaged to read clearly, was recovering at the local veterinary clinic under round-the-clock care from volunteers who had been moved by his story. His injuries were severe, but not life-threatening, and his behavior was puzzling to everyone who interacted with him during his recovery period. Despite being heavily sedated for surgery to repair his broken ribs and clean his infected wounds, he remained alert and agitated whenever anyone mentioned the baby or tried to move him away from the clinic's phone, where updates on her condition were being received hourly from the hospital staff. It was Officer Gina Morales who first made the connection that would crack the case wide open and expose the dark truth lurking beneath Cedar Grove's quiet surface. Unable to sleep after her shift ended, haunted by the image of that tiny face in the backpack, she had spent hours going through missing persons reports, cross-referencing them with recent births, and looking for any pattern that might explain how a 3-month-old baby had ended up in a backpack during a thunderstorm. The name that caught her attention was Maria Gonzalez, a 16-year-old who had been reported missing from a state-run group home 4 months earlier. The timing was right. If Maria had been pregnant when she disappeared, her baby would be approximately 3 months old now. But what really made Gina's pulse race and her hands tremble as she read the file was the last known contact listed in Maria's case documentation. She had been seen at a downtown food pantry just days before her disappearance, speaking privately with a volunteer coordinator named Thomas Burke, the same Thomas Burke who owned a retired police dog named Ryder, the same Thomas Burke who had called in a report about his missing dog just 3 days before. Ryder appeared at the station with baby Hope clutched protectively in his jaws. The confrontation at Thomas Burke's cabin unfolded like a scene from a psychological thriller, with Monroe's training warring against her disbelief at what she was discovering about this man she thought she knew. Burke's immediate admission that he knew about the baby caught her completely off guard. Most suspects would have feigned ignorance, demanded to see a warrant, or simply refused to cooperate. Instead, this broken former police officer seemed almost relieved that someone had finally come to confront him about the terrible secrets he had been carrying like stones in his chest. The cabin's interior told its own story of a man living on the edge of sanity, teetering between his former identity as a protector and his current reality as a predator. Everything was obsessively clean and organized, as if Burke had been trying to maintain control over his physical environment while his moral compass spun wildly out of true north. Military memorabilia covered every available wall surface: medals, commendations, photographs from his years of honorable service, creating a shrine to the man he used to be before darkness consumed his soul and transformed him into something unrecognizable. When Monroe pressed him about Maria's whereabouts, Burke's carefully maintained composure began to crumble like a dam under increasing pressure from floodwaters. His hands shook as he led her through the cabin, pointing out the room where Maria had stayed during her captivity, the makeshift nursery he had prepared for the baby in his twisted fantasy of playing savior, the kitchen where he had tried to care for a pregnant teenager whose trust he had systematically betrayed over weeks of imprisonment. Burke's account of Maria's final hours was delivered in a monotone voice that suggested he had rehearsed this confession in his mind countless times during sleepless nights. He described her labor in clinical terms, as if detaching himself emotionally from the horror of what had transpired in his basement chamber would somehow absolve him of responsibility for her death. According to Burke, Maria had gone into labor unexpectedly during a particularly violent thunderstorm 3 weeks earlier, her screams masked by the sound of rain hammering against the cabin's metal roof. He claimed he had tried to help her, had done everything in his limited power to save both mother and child, but complications had developed rapidly beyond his amateur medical abilities. The baby had been born alive but weak, while Maria had hemorrhaged beyond his ability to control with veterinary supplies and internet research. Burke insisted that he had attempted CPR, that he had seriously considered calling for emergency medical assistance, but Maria had died before he could make that crucial decision that might have saved her life. His story had holes large enough to drive a truck through, inconsistencies that Monroe's trained ear picked up immediately, despite her shock at what she was hearing. If Maria had died 3 weeks ago, how had he been caring for an infant all this time? Why hadn't he reported her death to authorities? What exactly had he been planning to do with baby Hope if Ryder hadn't intervened with his desperate midnight rescue mission? The discovery of Maria's grave behind Burke's cabin marked the pivotal moment when a heroic rescue story transformed into a homicide investigation that would shake Cedar Grove to its very foundations and expose the dark underbelly of the community's trusted institutions. Monroe had called for backup and forensic specialists before allowing Burke to lead her to the shallow depression in the earth where he claimed to have buried Maria's body 3 weeks earlier, though every instinct she possessed was screaming that his timeline didn't add up. What they found there would haunt everyone involved for years to come and fundamentally change how Cedar Grove viewed the people they had trusted with their most vulnerable citizens. The grave was barely 4 feet deep, hastily dug with what appeared to be a standard garden spade, and inadequately concealed beneath a thin layer of autumn leaves and forest debris that had already begun to blow away in the October winds. Burke had made no effort to mark the site or preserve any dignity for the young woman whose life had ended in his basement. She was buried like an unwanted pet, discarded and forgotten except for the guilt that gnawed at Burke's conscience during his increasingly sleepless nights. When the forensic team carefully exhumed the remains under the supervision of the county coroner, they confirmed what Monroe had already suspected based on her years of experience with death investigations. Maria Gonzalez had been dead for much longer than 3 weeks. The state of decomposition, even accounting for the cool October weather and the protective qualities of the shallow grave, suggested she had been buried at least 2 months earlier, which meant Burke had been caring for baby Hope far longer than he had admitted to Monroe during their initial confrontation. More disturbing still were the physical signs that Maria had been systematically restrained during her final weeks of life, rope marks on her wrists and ankles that had healed before death, suggesting prolonged captivity rather than the temporary sanctuary Burke had described in his carefully constructed lies. The medical examiner's preliminary findings painted a horrific picture of systematic abuse and criminal neglect that went far beyond what Burke had confessed. Maria had been severely malnourished during her pregnancy, showing signs of vitamin deficiencies and inadequate prenatal care that would have been obvious to anyone with basic medical knowledge. Her body bore evidence of old injuries that told a story of prolonged abuse, healed fractures in her ribs, scarring, consistent with repeated physical trauma, and marks that suggested she had been confined in a small space for extended periods. Most damning of all was the forensic evidence that she had given birth while physically restrained, with ligature marks on her wrists, indicating she had been tied down during labor like an animal. Burke's story of trying to help Maria through a difficult delivery was exposed as a complete fabrication designed to minimize his culpability. He had imprisoned her, controlled every aspect of her existence, and ultimately caused her death through criminal negligence that bordered on intentional murder. Meanwhile, back at the veterinary clinic where he was recovering from his heroic journey, Ryder's behavior was being closely monitored by both medical staff and police investigators, who were beginning to understand that this remarkable dog was their most valuable witness to crimes that defied human comprehension and challenged everything they thought they knew about. Evil hiding in plain sight. The arrest of Thomas Burke sent shockwaves through Cedar Grove that reverberated far beyond the town's borders, exposing a network of complicity and willful blindness that had enabled his crimes for years, while trusted institutions turned their backs on vulnerable children. When Monroe placed the handcuffs on Burke's wrists in his cabin's living room, surrounded by the military honors and commendations that now seemed like mockeries of everything law enforcement was supposed to represent, she felt a profound sense of betrayal that would haunt her for the rest of her career. This wasn't just the arrest of a criminal, it was the fall of someone who had sworn the same oath she had, who had worn the same badge, who had been entrusted with protecting the innocent, and had instead become their most dangerous predator. Burke didn't resist arrest, didn't demand lawyers, or protest his innocence like most suspects would when confronted with overwhelming evidence. Instead, he seemed almost relieved to finally be caught, as if the weight of his terrible secrets had become too heavy to carry any longer, and the pretense of normalcy had become exhausting. During the drive to the county jail, he stared out the window at the pine forests where he had hidden his crimes, occasionally muttering apologies that were too little and far too late to matter to anyone except perhaps his own tortured conscience. The booking process revealed the full extent of Burke's deception and the sophisticated nature of his predatory network. Hidden in his wallet were business cards from multiple youth services organizations across 3 counties, all listing him as a volunteer coordinator or mentor, with glowing references from supervisors who had never bothered to look beneath his carefully constructed facade. He had been operating on a scale that investigators were only beginning to comprehend, using his sterling reputation and law enforcement background to gain access to vulnerable teenagers throughout the region, while authorities praised his dedication to helping troubled youth. Meanwhile, the investigation into Burke's activities was expanding rapidly as detectives from multiple jurisdictions coordinated their efforts to uncover the full scope of his crimes and identify other potential victims who might still be alive and in need of rescue. Search warrants were executed at the offices of every organization where Burke had volunteered, and what they found painted a picture of systemic failure that went far beyond one man's evil impulses and revealed how institutions designed to protect children had instead enabled their exploitation. Burke had been carefully documenting his activities in journals and computer files that read like a predator's instruction manual, detailed profiles of vulnerable girls, notes about their psychological weaknesses and family situations, strategies for isolating them from support systems, and meticulous records of which girls were most likely to be believed if they reported abuse to authorities. The digital evidence revealed that Burke had been in contact with other individuals who shared his twisted interests, part of a loose network of predators who traded information about vulnerable children and even shared victims across state lines, while law enforcement agencies failed to connect the dots between missing persons cases in different jurisdictions. Ryder's recovery became a symbol of hope for Cedar Grove as the town struggled to process the magnitude of Burke's crimes and their implications for everyone who had trusted him with their most precious responsibility, the safety of their children. The veterinary clinic where he was being treated became an unofficial pilgrimage site for residents who wanted to pay their respects to the dog who had exposed the darkness hiding in their midst, while they had remained blissfully unaware of the horrors taking place just miles from their homes. Children brought drawings depicting Ryder as a superhero, Adults left flowers and handwritten notes of gratitude, and law enforcement officers from across the state stopped by to honor a fellow member of the Thin Blue Line who had remained true to his oath even when his human partner had betrayed everything they both stood for during their years of service together. Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian overseeing Ryder's care, reported that his recovery was progressing remarkably well considering the severity of his injuries and the psychological trauma he had endured during his desperate journey through the storm and his months of witnessing Burke's crimes. The broken ribs were healing cleanly without complications, the infected wounds were responding well to antibiotics, and his appetite had returned with a vengeance that suggested his fighting spirit remained intact. But what impressed Dr. Chen most was Ryder's psychological resilience. Despite everything he had witnessed and endured in that isolated cabin, he showed no signs of the fearfulness or aggression that often plagued abuse survivors, both human and animal. Instead, he seemed almost serene, as if completing his mission to save baby Hope had given him a sense of peace that transcended his physical suffering and validated his decision to break free from his loyalty to Burke. Officer Gina Morales had been visiting Ryder daily since his arrival at the clinic, partly out of professional interest in the investigation, but mostly because she felt a profound personal connection to the dog who had saved baby Hope's life and exposed crimes that might have continued for years without his intervention. During one of these visits, Dr. Chen mentioned that Ryder would need a permanent home once his recovery was complete. His advanced age and lingering injuries meant he could never return to active police duty, and his former handler was obviously no longer an option given his current residence in the county jail awaiting trial. Gina didn't hesitate to volunteer to adopt him, despite having no experience with large dogs and living in a small apartment that barely had room for her own belongings, much less a German shepherd with special medical needs. Meanwhile, baby Hope was thriving in foster care under the loving supervision of Diane Walsh, a pediatric nurse who had fallen in love with the tiny fighter the moment she held her in the hospital emergency room. Diane had been working closely with Child Protective Services to navigate the complex legal process of adoption, determined to provide Hope with the stable, loving home that her birth mother had been cruelly denied. The baby was meeting all her developmental milestones despite her traumatic start in life, and her bright, curious nature suggested that she would grow up to be a remarkable young woman with the strength to overcome any obstacle life might place in her path. As the seasons changed, and Cedar Grove slowly began to heal from the revelations that had shattered its sense of security and trust in institutions, the legacy of that storm-swept night continued to ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted when Ryder first limped through the rain toward the police station. Thomas Burke was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after pleading guilty to charges including murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and trafficking minors across state lines, a conviction that led to sweeping reforms in the youth services system throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. New oversight protocols were implemented, mandatory background checks became more rigorous, and enhanced training for staff and volunteers was designed to prevent future predators from exploiting the system's vulnerabilities and the children it was meant to protect. But for those most directly affected by Burke's crimes, justice in the courtroom was only the beginning of a longer journey toward healing and understanding the profound impact of one dog's courage on countless lives. Ryder lived out his remaining years in the loving care of Officer Gina Morales, who discovered that sharing her life with a hero had unexpected rewards beyond the obvious companionship and unconditional love that only a dog can provide. Ryder seemed to understand intuitively that his mission wasn't finished simply because Burke was behind bars. He became a therapy dog for other trauma survivors, visiting hospitals, shelters, and counseling centers where his calm presence provided comfort to those struggling to rebuild their lives after experiencing unthinkable horrors. His story inspired the creation of specialized K-9 units dedicated to helping victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, programs that spread to police departments across the country and saved countless other victims from similar fates. Baby Hope, officially adopted by Diane Walsh and renamed Isabella Hope Walsh, grew up knowing the remarkable story of how she had been saved by a dog who refused to abandon his duty even when his handler had abandoned his humanity and everything he had once sworn to protect. As she matured into a confident, compassionate young woman, Isabella often spoke about feeling a special connection to animals and a calling to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, following a path that seemed destined from that stormy night when Ryder carried her to safety. She would eventually become a social worker, specializing in cases involving exploited children, carrying forward the legacy of courage and compassion that had saved her life and given her a future filled with purpose and meaning. On quiet evenings, when Isabella was doing homework at the kitchen table and Ryder was sleeping peacefully by the fireplace in his final years, Diane would sometimes find herself wondering about the mysteries that would never be fully solved and the questions that would haunt Cedar Grove forever. How many other victims were there who had never been found? How many other predators were still out there, hiding behind facades of respectability and trust? How many other heroes like Ryder were watching and waiting, ready to act when the moment demanded courage over loyalty, justice over silence? The memorial statue erected in Cedar Grove Central Park depicted a German shepherd standing alert, a small backpack at his feet, his bronze eyes fixed on some distant horizon where hope and heroism intersect in ways that transcend species and remind us that sometimes the greatest acts of love come from the most unexpected sources. And you, have you ever witnessed any heroic animal act? Tell us your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.